The idea of putting your audience segments into different boxes and kind of constructing these fictions around them is really nothing new. Netflix and Disney Plus do this to a lot of their users.
All right, welcome to Insights by Design, Episode 2. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Andrew. How have you been on your side of the fence?
Good. It was a busy week, a lot going on in the data world, a lot of meetings, a lot of trips. What were you up to this week?
Oh, not too much. Just here on the faculty side of things, we're finishing up our semester, trying to get all of our grades in, and then trying to get some relaxation in before the next wave of students comes in January. But it's good times. I think Arizona is really lovely in January. The weather's cool, the weather's clear. You can still get out and do stuff. So we ain't got nothing to complain about.
That's right. And you're going to Colorado soon? Is that right?
Yep, we're going to go see the parents and the grandparents. Fun fact for the listeners, we have a grandmother who's well into her 90s, and her knees crack a lot less than mine do. And so, I mean, it's just a delight to see her in Colorado and catch up with her. She's a fountain of wisdom, and so we're excited to go see both the grandparents and the great grandparents.
That'll be fun. I think my family, I'm not going, but I think my family's going, and there'll be a little crossover with when you're there.
Yep,
Everyone
all
the
those
last
wild
week of
times.
December, first week of January. Excellent. Well, let's kick it off. So today, Michael and I wanted to focus on personas. So personas is becoming it's a normal topic for product management, for marketing, but in data analytics, business outcomes, and insights, it's a fairly new concept, but with data as a product, it's growing in popularity and momentum, which is really what Michael and I help focus on in our consultancy, is bringing a lot of these really effective product management, UX, design, and marketing concepts, implementing them within data to be able to drive those business outcomes and delight stakeholders. And personas is a key part of that. Michael's really an expert on personas. But for those who don't know, Michael, what is a persona? How would you even define that to somebody who's new to that concept?
Yeah, so personas in the world of data analytics is or in user experience is different from the way we usually use it just in popular speech. You know, when you go to a Taylor Swift concert, she's going to have lots of changes of clothing. She's going to be zombie Taylor, she's going to be classy Taylor, adopting these different roles depending on the song. And that's not really what personas are in data analytics. Personas are fictional characters with fictional stories that illustrate different parts of your data. Because if you give a team of developers and designers and business managers a list of Excel data in a spreadsheet, they might wonder, like, well, like, what exactly does this teach us about our audience, or what decisions do we need to make based on all these numbers? It's hard to empathize with an Excel spreadsheet. So part of the idea behind personas is you construct these fictional characters with fictional backstories that represent different parts of your audience so that you can actually think about what they represent.
I like to think of them as like broad stereotypes. So often they're based on like real people or real groups of people, but they take those characteristics and you model them into something that gives you guidance and direction to build around. Does that sound right? That's how I view it. It could be wrong.
Yeah, I'm a little resistant to the term stereotypes because people use that as a reason not to use personas. In fact, I was at a professional gathering recently, and this UX researcher stood up and said, "We do not use personas because personas are stereotypes, and stereotypes are bad." I think that personas, if done poorly, are stereotypes, but if they're done well, they're not. They're an interpretation of your data that puts you in a better position to communicate that data and to make decisions about it.
So for your colleague who pushed back on personas, did they have an alternative? Or did they just say, we don't like this and we don't have another option?
Well, these are academics, so they just said, we don't like this and we don't have another option, as I recall. But that is a critique that you see even in industry. Like, we don't want to stereotype, especially now that people are very sensitive about just demographic differences and neurological differences. But the idea of putting your audience segments into different boxes and kind of constructing these fictions around them is really nothing new. Netflix and Disney Plus do this to a lot of their users based on what you click on. They are putting you in a box and making you part of a persona for their back end. But this goes all the way back to Aristotle, who says in one of his treatises on rhetoric, old men are kind of like this. And so this is how you should talk to them in order to persuade them. And younger men tend to be like this. And so here's how you should adjust your language to persuade them. And middle-aged men are sort of like this. And so I think as long as you keep some flexibility and realize that personas are based in reality, but are not a perfect reflection of reality, you can get around accusations of stereotypes. And then when I have students do personas, I always encourage them to just actively make them demographically and psychographically diverse. Because for some reason, a lot of my students like to make all of their personas, at least on the first draft, very white, very Arizonan, because we're located here in Arizona. But personas are much more useful, I think, when you really try to maximize the demographics of the underlying data and the psychographics of your underlying data. And let me define those real quick, just so we're all on the same page. So demographics are things that you usually see in survey data, such as ages of your customers, gender, educational background, how often they use your product or service, stuff like that. That tends to be something external. But then psychographics are more internal. These tend to be things like motivations and beliefs and values and some more of their personal history. And both demographics and psychographics can be really significant in constructing personas. You want people who look different in your persona data set, different ages, different sexes or genders, different backgrounds and experiences, but then you also want to include personas who are using your product or service for different reasons. So to continue the Taylor Swift metaphor, there's lots of people who are going to the Eras tour. There are people like my lovely wife Christina, who wants to go, and if she could go, she would just be a diehard Swiftie. She does not need to be persuaded to buy that ticket. She will just go in a straight line from access ticket to purchase ticket, and that could be
The
what sort
friendship
of persona.
bracelets.
The friendship. Oh, she does have a friendship bracelet, I think. Now that you mention it, yeah. So Christina is not representative of every Taylor Swift fan, but kind of middle-aged, long-time fans, high level of interest. That captures different aspects of lots of other people who are going to the Eras tour. Then you have crotchety old people like me who don't know very much about Taylor Swift, even though I try to give her a shout out on every podcast that we do, apparently. And maybe I just want to be husband of the year and try to get Christina some Eras tour tickets. And so I might need to be persuaded a little bit more to move up front rather than be behind a load-bearing pillar. Maybe I need to be educated more about who Taylor Swift is, more about her show dates. Maybe I'm not willing to travel to the concert, so I need to find tickets that are more specific to my location. Maybe I'm trying to save money. Maybe I'm trying to be extravagant. So I would be a whole different type of user that could be captured in personas. And if the concert designers and the web page designers had a Michael in the data, represented by a persona, and a Christina in the data represented by another persona, they wouldn't capture all of their underlying audience, but they would get some pretty big chunks of it that would allow them to communicate who they expect to come and how they need to update their data strategy and their website or other sorts of purchasing venues to maximize the impact of that particular tour.
Now, is your recommendation to with diversifying demographics and psychographics, is it to diversify across personas and have a portfolio that's diversified, or is it within individual personas to try to have multiple psychographics and multiple demographics represented in that individual persona, trying to keep each individual persona broad? Or is it okay to have more specific personas but have a portfolio of them so that as a whole it's more representative? What are your thoughts?
there should always be a portfolio of personas. And when students first do them, and maybe some less experienced user experience designers as well, they usually put two. But I think personas are maximally useful if there's 3 to 5. If you have more than 5, yes, you're maximizing your demographics and your psychographics, but maybe I'm just not very smart, but I have a hard time thinking and empathizing with more than 5 personas at a time. So if you can break your data down into just 3 to 5 personas and make those 3 to 5 a portfolio of different demographics and psychographics, then I think you're giving yourself a pretty solid foundation to either communicate your data or make decisions with it. And so the short answer to your question is a portfolio, but a small portfolio.
And that's super helpful. What's your process or recommended process for creating a persona? Is it, for instance, come with a hypothesis and say, I think these are the people that, or characteristics that are diverse, and let's build around that? Or is there some kind of methodology that you use?
Ah, well, every company will do it differently. And maybe I should distinguish between personas and what we could call proto personas,
Hmm.
because companies that have established personas have done a lot of research, typically through survey data, to get a good sense of who their customers are, who their customers' friends are, who their stakeholders are. And so those are fully developed personas because they know that at least at that point in time, those personas are capturing significant segments of their audience. But I think there's also value in proto personas, and I often encourage designers and researchers to create proto personas at the beginning of a project. You might not have access to all of the data yet, and your project might still be up in the air. Maybe there's some things that you're still trying to figure out. But if you sketch out different personalities, different demographics, different psychographics of who you imagine using the product or service, then I think you're doing yourself a favor because you're surfacing your own assumptions. And sometimes, as designers and researchers and data managers, we keep our assumptions hidden and then wonder why people disagree with us or don't understand our thought process. So, at the very beginning of a project, I think it's useful to make proto personas. They're not super data intensive yet, but it's helpful to sketch out just here's who I think I'm trying to communicate with, like these 3 to 5 very different people. Or if you're starting from scratch with a new project, maybe these personas are aspirational. Maybe these proto personas are who you want to reach with your new data project. But as the project matures, I think that you want to collect as much data on your audience as you can and then continually update and iterate so that the personas become valuable, not just for communicating your data, but for actually making decisions. And so, to go back to the Michael and Christina example, you could actually go into a data meeting and say, okay, we want to make the user experience of this product or service better for Michael. Here's his background. Here's his imaginary demographics and psychographics. What do you guys think? As opposed to, again, just here's this wall of numbers. Like, how do you transform those numbers into information and insights? Well, a really generative way is by building these personas because it converts data into people, fake people, but people and a story. And it makes the data really accessible because you're probably going to be working with on your project people who are not data specialists. One reason why I do UX is because I am terrible at technology. People need to explain things to me in simple terms. And so if you come at me with a wall of data, I'm probably going to feel overwhelmed or shut down or not have very much to contribute to in a potentially high stakes meeting. But if the data analyst comes in with personas, then I can ask questions, then I can contribute a lot more. And so if I had to break down the process of making personas, just real simple, I would say start with your own assumptions and then iterate and collect data from any source that you can. Surveys can be very expensive, but I think more than ever before, data analysts have access to more types of data. So you can consider things like videos, you can consider things like image, or you can consider things like search histories, whatever you have access to help build those personas. And again, you're not going to capture every segment of your audience, but you should try to get the big 3 to 5. Either your established customer base or your aspirational customer base.
Yeah, your point about iterating is super important. And we see that that helps alleviate a lot of the issues that we have with our clients. One of the reasons they call us in is because they've got all this data they've got these data products they've created that are supposed to serve stakeholders, and they find that it's not meeting their stakeholders' needs, their jobs to be done. And one of the underlying reasons for this is often because they have come up with a persona. They don't call it a persona, but they've got some stakeholder that they're trying to serve. They built a data product, maybe a dashboard, in order to try to serve them. And a few things can happen. One, maybe the dashboard, the data product is too specific and it doesn't generalize well. And then they're confused why people don't use it. And maybe it was even for that specific stakeholder that they had created it for. It's no longer meeting their job to be done. Their job to be done has evolved, and the data product hasn't evolved with it. That's an issue. Also, your stakeholders, if you look at them by role, right? So Michael and I work at ASU, and some of the roles there are faculty, students, deans, administrators, finance people, those kind of things. You would think that those naturally group into personas and that they may be using the same data, which is sometimes true. However, it's not always true. So having some kind of methodology where you can identify the underlying characteristics and use cases and jobs to be done and cluster those folks together and create personas that represent them, you may be surprised that not all of the deans fall under the same persona. They may fall under personas with some of the faculty and with their jobs to be done. So iterating and having an open mind and a methodology that's repeatable can really help you improve your effectiveness. We throw data products out there and we hope that they work, and sometimes they do, but then sometimes other folks come in and either one, it's too specific, or then other folks are like, oh, I would use this if you add this feature to it. We add that feature. Oh, I would use it if you add this feature. We add that feature. I'd use it if you add this feature. We add this feature. Now we've got some kind of Frankenstein of a product that's now too complicated and doesn't really serve anybody. So having that process in place is super important.
Yeah, you touched on a couple points that I think are re-emphasizing. So when constructing personas, I think it's good to just start really simple. They don't have to be super complicated with like a whole epidemiological backstory, like starting at the age of 6 months, like Dean so-and-so knew she was destined for greatness. And then we trace her up to the age of 60, where she's a sterling scholar. Like, that's not necessarily useful. But you mentioned the importance of roles and functions within an organization, and that's a great place to start. If you need to create a data product that's supposed to serve in a complex organization, start out by mapping both your assumptions as well as the different roles and functions that are in that organization. And like you mentioned, just because someone is a dean, for instance, in higher education, doesn't mean they're necessarily going to act like all of the deans. They could act more like a faculty member. And so I think it's important to keep an open mind that not everyone in the same role is going to act uniformly. And that's where I think histories and demographics and psychographics can really provide some helpful nuance. And so maybe the first cut is your own assumptions. Second cut is what sorts of roles are within the organization that the product needs to serve. And then the third cut is the personalities, the racials, the gender data and things like that to help you visualize the diversity of the organization. So start pretty simple, and simple is good. Simple can get you pretty far, but then add more nuance as the project gets more complicated.
Another area that I find helpful for building personas is with access management. So in data, right, you should only be showing specific data to specific people for a specific reason. And if there's not a reason to show that data to anybody, you shouldn't have that data. So access management is super important. And I find it helpful to map access management where possible to these personas. Some folks need to see aggregated data. They just need to see the averages or the sums of different groups. Others need row level data. They need to see the individual people that make up that data. And it's not all the same people who need to see that. Not everybody should see row level data. They don't need to see individuals when they could see aggregated groups, which is much more secure, much more private, because you're not seeing those individuals. And personas is an excellent way to manage that. And it's really, as you said, empathizing. So what's your process for empathizing with a persona, getting to know them, trying to understand like how would this persona interact with this product or this experience?
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of the empathy comes in the psychographics. If I just see someone who says like, I don't know, middle-aged white guy, upper 30s, like those are my demographics, but I'm not going to say like, "Oh, that's me, like this company understands me so well," or something like that. But I think the backstories that people have are what are potentially really powerful. And that's the sort of stuff that really enables not just communication of the data, but decisions based on the data. And that's a critique of personas that maybe is worth mentioning. Some people say personas are great for helping people understand the projects you're working on, maybe by getting your team together and saying, okay, like these are the stakeholders we're serving. But if personas are done well, you can go a step further and say, well, what's the next thing we need to do to make this project even better? How do we enhance our product or service, take it to the next level based on our personas? And some people are uncomfortable with that. Some people think that design decisions should not be based on personas. But I think that if personas are done well, they trigger that empathy that you mentioned, but they also trigger your imagination in really productive ways. And let me give you just a snippet of some of the research that I work on in the Arizona cannabis industry. And again, I approach this from a public health standpoint. So don't smoke doobies, kids. It's not good for you. The more we learn about cannabis, the less good it's looking. So, with that caveat in mind, there are a lot of dispensaries in the state of Arizona who serve a pretty diverse client base because lots of people shop for marijuana products for a variety of different reasons. And it's not super helpful to show dispensary owners things like, okay, this is Jim. He's 62 years old and he's sick. Maybe a little bit with that sick, but if you help people understand the motivations why people are coming to the website or why they're coming to the dispensary shelves. Jim is 62 years old. He struggled his whole life with chronic pain. He was on opioids for 30 years and his teeth fell out. And so his doctor eventually prescribed him a cannabis product. And even though the science doesn't necessarily support all of these uses, he says he feels so much better and he's able to function and he's gotten a lot of his life back. That's when you're starting to trigger empathy because it's a backstory to help you understand the needs, the beliefs, the motivations, and the values. And you also create a kind of internal service line with multiple points of interventions. And so if the dispensary wanted to improve their products or services, they could look at people who are in different life situations as Jim, maybe older people, maybe they're chronic pain patients, maybe they want to improve their handoffs with doctors. Handoffs is probably not the right term, but understanding what makes people tick, I think, is where empathy can really be useful and go hand in hand with imagination. And then there's other cannabis users. Maybe there's Jessica, who's 21 years old. She's visiting the state from a place where cannabis is illegal, and she just wants to have a real great time. But as a first time or a regular user, she doesn't understand that cannabis brownies and cannabis gummies and cannabis drinks can make her high as a kite, but maybe 45 minutes after ingestion. And so she needs to learn to be patient and not do something dangerous, but to expect potentially a delayed high or uneven effects and things like that. So an old salt like Jim, who's maybe been taking cannabis products for many years of his life, doesn't have as high of a risk profile, but someone who's maybe more young and more impulsive and less experienced with cannabis products like Jessica are going to have very different needs because her uses of cannabis are very different. And I mean, this is where you want to be careful stereotyping too, because you don't want to make people, prejudiced against Jessica, because in the state of Arizona, 21-year-olds who are responsible, of course, can use cannabis products as well. That is the state law, and that is the business niche that dispensaries fill. And so, but again, I think it illustrates how backstories and like fleshing out like the different colors and nuances, beliefs and values of these different individuals really helps you imagine who is coming to your store, who is using your products and services. And once you start to not just think about them, but start to feel something and hear a little bit, then I think you're in a much better position to not just communicate your data, but to make decisions based on it because it's triggering your empathy, your imagination, and maybe also your intuition. Because if you've taken a deep dive into your data, I think a lot of times you can trust your gut. If you've done the hard work to know what's actually underneath the personas and you've understood the personas, then you're in a better position to go with your gut within reason on the next steps within a data project.
As you noted, other industries have and professions have been using personas for a long time. And it's fairly new to data, viewing data as a product. And it's, if folks are listening and thinking like, that's a lot of work, that's because it's a product manager's job in order to do this. And the product manager, we've seen a meteoric rise in the number of product manager job postings. It's a newer title, but almost every company I've looked at has been trying to add them, because the data product manager, really, that's their role, is to develop these personas, to have the vision of what are our capabilities, what do our end stakeholders need, how can we group them in an effective way, and how can we drive the data product development to meet their needs, and then have a process for evaluating and iterating. If
yeah, personas can seem really silly. Personas can seem really silly until you actually use them. Because when you first see them on paper, you think, well, that is just stupid. Like, I am just making up stories. This is not scientific. And that's a valid criticism. But I would encourage all of our listeners, if you're involved in a complex data project or in a team that you need to get on the same page, try it and see if you can come up with your own sort of style. You don't necessarily have to call them personas if you're getting a lot of pushback. You can call it something like audience analysis or audience segmentation, which can be very quantitative. As you kind of flicking your eyes around, so I sense you have a response to that. But you don't have to necessarily call them personas to give a face and a feeling to your data.
Yeah, you can just call them stakeholders, right? They don't have to have a name, but understanding your stakeholders is incredibly important. I'll give you an example from yesterday. I was sitting in on another team's evaluation because they needed some help with a Tableau dashboard that they were building. And it was really well done. They followed some really great accessibility rules and using grayscale effectively, but they got down to this funnel chart and they were really mentally struggling with how to situate and design the funnel chart with a delta in between each funnel, showing the difference of change as information passes through the funnel. They're like, should I do a butterfly chart? Should I do this? Should I do that? Where should I have this? And like at that point, it's just an opinion, right? It's just an opinion of like what looks good. So after listening in on this for, I don't know, probably 15 minutes, like it went a while, they're like, should we put a Figma image behind it? So where's your starting point? So I asked them, like, who's the end user of this? And they kind of told me, like, what's their job to be done? Like, when they look at this, what are they trying to, what do they need to understand in order to get what done? And so they thought about it. And I don't think they had really processed this before. Then they were like, oh, it's they want to see this information. Like, but why? What are they going to do with this information? What decision are they trying to make? Like, what's the strategy that this needs to support? They thought about it and they're like, oh, well, I think they're going to do it this way. Like, so leave it alone. Like, when I look at that, I get like, I can accomplish that decision with what you already have. We don't need to spend 20 minutes deciding, should it be a butterfly chart or a funnel chart, if it already meets the job to be done. So understanding your end users, grouping them effectively, does help simplify design decisions in my mind, because it takes your bias out of it in a lot of ways.
That's really a key question that you mentioned, Andrew. What's the job that your stakeholders need to get done? And the personas probably won't say things like, Jessica prefers funnel charts, Jim prefers butterfly charts, or things like that. But in the cannabis dispensary example, Jim is sick and wants to feel better. Jessica is new in town and wants to have a great time. And so when developing personas, I think that's a question that can guide a lot of decisions about what to include and what to exclude. What are the jobs that your different stakeholders need to get done? And it can really be that simple. I mean, yes, I think like having empathy and imagination and intuition is important, but if your personas are not helping people do their job or do their job better, then they're falling flat. And it's probably time to take another look at them, maybe simplify and make them more focused on function and not just, you know, demographic and psychographic diversity.
Yeah, a lot of times data folks get stuck on just the data. They get a data request to say, I need to see XYZ. I need to see last month's sales, and I want to see, month over month sales going forward. And they stop there. Like, okay. And then they start working with the data engineers. Let's build a pipeline and let's get this and let's get it in a dashboard and we'll have it dynamically update month over month. They don't understand what we're looking at. They do make an assumption like, oh, we just want to see if, like, are we growing? Are we not growing? Are there problems? But they don't know. They don't know the job to be done. They don't know, is there a finance concern? Is there an employee concern? Like, we're looking at productivity. Are we looking at financial stability of the organization? Different things you may look at. So understanding like what's the user asking for, but why are they asking for it? It's that next step. And then being able to group the whys together is a really effective way to group your stakeholders, because often the whys overlap, but not always. Sometimes the whys are matrix. They go across different roles. And then being able to provide that information to the right people at the right time, regardless of what their role is the difference between analytics or data as a service and analytics and data as a product to drive insights.
So I think we could say that personas are useful on their own. But they're probably doubly useful when they're combined with other sorts of visuals like use flows or task flows, because, and I've heard that thing called different things, but basically a map of the different steps in your service or the different steps in your product that people need to go through in order to buy Taylor Swift concert tickets or medical marijuana products, or maybe something like an enrollment request or something like that. And so I think personas should exist in a greater ecology of different visualizations that data analysts can and probably should make at some point in order to communicate their results and to start to make decisions. And so, hearing about Jim and Jessica who are going to the cannabis dispensary is useful, but it could be even more useful if you said, okay, like, well, Jim's traveling out of state, or like he only shops for cannabis online. Here's the different steps in the website. Here's where the friction is coming in. Jessica always goes up in person. Like, what does the front end look like? What does the product labeling look like? How do dispensary bud tenders interact with her? And so those use flows or task flows, I think, add a whole nother dimension to personas that gives them basically a world to live in. Not like an epic fantasy world. Like, you don't have to be Tolkien here, but you do want to situate them within the context of the organization. And one of the downsides to personas, I think we could say, is that they don't necessarily show you the internal flaws of your system. They're kind of a way of looking into your system from the outside. But if you combine personas with just a map of the different points in the service that stakeholders need to get through to get from point A to point B, the finished product, then the personas will make a whole lot more sense. And so I think a best practice would probably be make personas so that you understand your users, but also make sure you understand the backside, the things that the users don't necessarily see. And are there inefficiencies in the data pipeline at some point that can enhance the the user experience across persona types?
That's right. And that's really where a product manager or a analyst or a data engineer who understands these abilities or a consultant like what Michael and I do is incredibly helpful, because part of that process is ensuring that personas don't live in a vacuum. It's aligning it with the value stream mapping, with the process mapping. And then once a product is built, having that process to iterate can include conjoint analysis, understanding like we've built this product around these personas and these stakeholders based on this research. Now in the real world, let's figure out which of the features or parts of the experience are most important to which people. And that can help you group the stakeholders again and more effectively, understanding who's using what and why and when. You can do conjoint analysis through observation, through surveys. Are you familiar with conjoint analysis, Michael? I assume you are.
Explain it to me like I'm 6. Is it Wired Magazine that does like 5 different levels of complexity? Let's see if we can do
Okay.
that.
We've got 2 levels of complexity.
Okay, 2 levels is a good start.
So conjoint analysis is taking a product or an experience and breaking it down into its individual components. So let's use a data dashboard in this example. So a dashboard can be composed of multiple graphics, multiple filters, multiple pages, and drill downs. And each of those are individual components making up the product of the dashboard. So what you can do is either by observation or survey with the end users, understand which of those individual components is most important to your end users and which end users and why. So survey questions can be formed to understand like which ones do you use the most, when do you use them, why do you use them, which do you never use. Observation can be focused on answering questions. So providing the user, hey, if you were trying to figure out the answer to this question, how would you do it? Or what are the top 5 jobs to be done that you have that you come to these products for? Show me how you would answer them. And you can watch, what do they use, what do they not use, what order do they use them in. And that helps you eliminate noise, right? Get rid of features that aren't helpful at all. And then to be able to group your end users together. Maybe there's a group of end users that surprisingly values the same components in the same order in the same way that you hadn't thought of before or hadn't realized. So it constantly helps you iterate and improve your product and your experience.
Okay. I was thinking maybe a partial example is emergency departments, where different stakeholders value different parts of the process in various ways. And one thing we saw with a client I was working with in South Carolina is that for emergency department staff, I mean, the check-in, of course, is very important because one, it's a bad thing, like federally, if people come within a certain distance of the emergency department and then they leave without receiving services. That's something that the government tracks, and it's related to a law called EMTALA, EMTALA, emergency something, something, something. I forget exactly what it stands for, but it's super important. And so when people come to the emergency department, like they want to make sure that they get you in, they want to check really quick to make sure that you don't have a condition that could literally kill you, like a heart attack. They want to make sure that they serve you really quickly. But if the front desk determines that you don't have a super critical condition, I'm using all the technical terms here, then it's totally okay for them to have you wait before you see a doctor, and maybe you're going to be waiting for 3 hours or even longer before you're officially triaged by the triage nurse, and when you're taken back into a bed, and then you finally get to see a doctor or a physician's assistant. And so all parts of those process are pretty important to staff because they care, of course, about patient safety and patient wellness, but also with throughput. But we found that with a lot of the people who are coming to the emergency department, they don't care as much about check-in. The main thing that they were focused on was, I want to see the doctor. Why is it taking me so long to see the doctor? And I would sometimes sit out in the waiting room and just talk to people who, appeared to be well enough to talk to, and just say, like, do you understand like how the emergency department works, or what do you think comes next in this process? And I remember one lady looked at me and said, I don't actually know. They just told me to wait here. Like, how long am I supposed to wait here? What comes next? Who do I talk to next? All I need to know. all I really know is that I really want to see a doctor because I feel terrible and I don't know where else to go to. And so I think an implication for data analysts in healthcare, especially, or people on the front end of service design, is make your process apparent. When you take a survey, there's often a little bar at the top that says you're 35% complete or you are here on the map. And so, even if people value different parts of your service in various ways, I think making your service transparent to your stakeholders helps them at least appreciate the bigger picture. So maybe they technically fall into this kind of persona, but you can also help your personas or your audience segments empathize with each other to help them understand why, say, an emergency department, which can be very broken, of course. I'm not justifying the American medical system here, but why an emergency department tends to work the way it does, and why you don't usually see a doctor right away, or maybe someone who checked in an hour after you is going back before you do, or how there's often a triage process before you get back to see the actual physician. And so, all this to say, I support your your idea that mapping out your process and understanding that people will value different parts of the process is super key for understanding how your personas are going to translate, not from data to information to insights.
Yeah, and that's I like how you talk about transparency, which is incredibly important with after you do the process mapping, making that clear to different people. Um, Recently, so I've taken over a new department. The process was not very clear, I think, even to the internal folks on the data team, of how requests are brought in, what's the intake process, how are they prioritized, and what does the output look like. It was fairly disorganized, and I don't think the prioritization was there beyond who's complaining loudest for urgency, or like what's the absolute like milestone that's about to blow up because we haven't fulfilled some data request. So I went in and I started looking at like all the different requests and coming up with a methodology for how to prioritize. And I received a request from a team. I looked at it, wasn't a priority. And so I let them know, like, we're not going to, and they asked for an end data by the end of the year. Not going to happen. So I let them know, we're likely not going to work on this even until January. Super upset, immediately upset. So then I walked them through my process. I'm like, I understand what you're saying. Like, you're not getting served right now. Let me show you how this works. I showed them the intake. I showed them our backlog. I showed them my prioritization process of impact versus effort, and how when I had interviewed them previously before saying, no, we're not going to do this, I asked them, what's the impact? Give me an impact statement of what's the value that we drive if we do this, and what's the hinderment to student success or student satisfaction if we don't do this, and help me quantify that. And the impact, honestly, was fairly minimal. A very small percentage of the students would be impacted, and they wouldn't be impacted in a way that 100% would stop their success or make them dissatisfied. And so I showed them, I'm like, look, it's minimal impact, it's high effort. You are low on the list. Here's all these other things that we have prioritized because they're low effort, high impact, or they're high effort, high impact. These all come first. And so once they saw that, then they got the context in the background of, oh, okay, I understand that. And then they were much more happy. So that transparency in the process is incredibly key for working with both end users and internal partners. But you have to understand that first yourself. Like, you have to have mapped it out, and you have to have a methodology that you can speak to that's fair and reasoned, but also agile, so that as new requests come in, right, you can map them against your priorities and put them in the right spot and get it done at the right time for the right people, and make that transparent to everyone.
And to return to a point you mentioned earlier, you don't have to be completely open about all parts of your data to all people all of the time, because a lot of data projects are very sensitive and not everybody can or should have access to all the individual data points. And so personas can be a useful way of communicating the data, but also protecting the data so that people understand the gist of what you're trying to do without violating privacy or access issues. But maybe
Yeah.
in these few minutes, we could just kind of recap and maybe distill some real quick best practices for personas. We had a wide-wheeling conversation. I don't know if any of my examples have made sense. So if they don't, please tell us in the comments below, and I will be happy to clarify. But what would you say are some best practices for personas based on your work, Andrew?
Treating analytics and data as a product and having that product mindset is key. And developing personas is a critical part of that so that you can empathize, you can understand your biases, as you noted, and you can have a process for creating and iterating products that delight and meet the needs of your end users. And personas is a critical tool in doing that.
Yeah, I had something very similar in mind. So at the start of a project, create your own proto-personas, something that's not super database just yet, to surface your own assumptions and to understand who you think you're working for. And then iterate to create more complex personas based on the actual data, make them demographically and psychographically diverse. 3 to 5 seems to be the magic number. If you disagree, let me know. 2 always seems to be way too few in my experience. More than 5 tends to be way too complex unless you're like Netflix or Disney Plus, which can have 40, 50, 60 personas depending on what kind of user you are. But I imagine that would be a team, a massive team and even enterprise level sort of analysis. But for starters, 3 to 5 is the magic number. And then I like your emphasis on function. Emphasize the function, the job that your personas need to get done, and then give them a world to live in within your product, within your service. How do they relate to the process of your company? How do they relate to the different service points, and understand that people are going to value different service points in different ways? And in general, communicate your process so that your personas have empathy, so that you not just have empathy for your personas, but your personas and the end users they represent have some empathy for each other.
Yeah, and I think some key points to remember are: one, have somebody assigned to this job of creating and maintaining personas, and make it clear how we create them, who's responsible for them, where do we document this, and how do they play into building and maintaining and iterating data products. Often it'll be team managers. If you're lucky enough to have a data product owner, it will be them. Or you can call consultants like Michael and myself who specialize in creating these personas and these workflows in order to drive business outcomes. And then also, once you've built them, right, you've created them, you don't have to build them every time, right? You go through, you have some process for iterating on them, but you've got them built. And now as you bring in new data products, or as you're refining data products, you can look to these personas to drive design decisions. So they're incredibly useful, right? Build once, or build a few times, and use many times. You can look to new data requests that come in, which personas are they aligning with, and how do we serve and delight those personas so that they can either, one, reduce their time, so save time in getting their job to be done, or add new abilities, so time well spent. They're either doing the same thing but faster in order to get their job done, or we're enabling them with new capabilities to do their job better. And aligning those with the personas and the data product management will be incredibly helpful and set data teams apart and drive business value and be able to justify ROI and be able to expand their capabilities. With your boards telling you, hey, we need to do AI, and your chief data officer saying, hey, we've got to figure out how to do AI, personas is going to be key to that. Are we doing AI? Are we doing generative AI? How are we doing that? We're laying an LLM on top of stuff so that our end users aren't looking at dashboards. They're really just asking plain English questions about the data and it's responding to them. Or are we using generative AI to help augment the dashboards? What are we doing? The strategy is built around the personas that we're serving. So it's really plug and play.
Yeah, so even if you don't want to ground design decisions in your personas, which isn't everyone's cup of tea, use personas to communicate your data. It's amazing how clear personas can make complex data structures, especially when you need to walk into a cross-functional meeting. It seems really silly until you see people getting excited about the data and talking about Jim or Jessica or Steve or Maria or however you call your personas. They don't necessarily have to have real people names. I've seen some companies name them after superheroes or things like that because they wanted to avoid stereotyping or over empathy with different sorts of audience groups, but use them to get your team on the same page, use it to communicate the data outside of your team and throughout the organization, evangelizing your data analytics projects. But if they're good, don't be afraid to base design decisions based on your battle tested data driven personas.
That's right. It supports your strategy. When you get these new requests or there's new technology you're evaluating, you're able to look to your personas and see how could this fit in? How could this work with these different personas? How would they use this? How would it change what they're doing? Could it help? Could it hinder? It gives you a solid foundation to make those decisions around. So if you're being asked about how are you going to use generative AI, this is likely a very good step for you to build that product mindset and then be able to work these new technologies into your existing strategy.